Hello Year 11, just a quick video from me today to look at some of the things you could say if you were making a comparison between Checking Out My History and the Poem of London. A really important part of the exam is your ability to draw out interesting and creative comparisons between these two poems, and I just want to give you some ideas of the way in which you might start to approach looking at this. Certainly what this video isn't is the essay plan that you would necessarily write, and certainly don't feel constricted by what I'm saying. You're very welcome to come up with your own ideas, but hopefully in watching this video you'll be able to get a gauge of some of the things that you could say about both of these poems if they came up on the exam. So just as a reminder of the sorts of things that you need to do in this exam, what can you compare? Well, basically to a certain extent anything. You're looking for, as long as it's linking to the question, anything that might be relevant as a comparative point. It could include things like language selections, and it could be as simple as the use of verbs or adjectives or nouns. It could be more like figurative language such as metaphors and similes. It might be their use of alliteration. Those sorts of things might be something you draw upon. Equally, it could be from a structural point of view. What are the themes or the tones created in the very beginning of the poem? What are those themes and tones like at the end of the poem? How do those poems change? How do those poems conclude? Is there a celebratory message, as we'll discover in Checking Out My History, or is there more of an oblique kind of negative image that's found at the end of the poems as well? So linking that to the themes as well, maybe the theme of identity or the theme of culture, the theme of war, how those themes are presented too. And another way you could compare is through the use of context. You should have covered or spoken about all of the poets, and you should be thinking about how their personal experiences are different, and that might have influenced the way that they've written the poem as well. You'll see on the slide here the 4 different assessment objectives for this exam. The first 3 are the most important for the poetry element. Basically, you need to have read, understood, and respond to the text. The higher marks, the ones which get the greatest number of marks on the question, are the ones who have that critical style. It's not a regurgitation. You're not wasting your time telling the story of the poem. It's an informed, personal response based on the question. You definitely need to use textual references, and notice it says textual references including quotations. It doesn't say you have to use quotations. I'd suggest you should use quotations for the poem that's given to you in the exam, but if you wanted to make more general reference to the methods used in or the specific moment in the poem and you can't quite remember the quotation, that's okay, but all of those quotations need to support your interpretation. One of the easiest ways to lose marks is to provide a quotation that doesn't really link to the point you're making. So you should be including short quotations that help back up and demonstrate the point that you've made in your paragraph. AO2, you're looking at the way that language is used, the way that form is used, the way that structure is used. Now, you don't have to talk about every single one of those, although I think for those higher marks, being able to talk about language, form and structure are really important features to think about. Language, as I mentioned before, is the kind of the words that you use. The structure is the way it's organized, the information when it's given, and the form is the type of poem that's been chosen. So for example, the most obvious one to talk about is Ozymandias. Ozymandias is written, the form of Ozymandias is a sonnet. So sonnet traditionally associated with love, whereas Checking Out My History, as we'll look at today, there isn't really a rigid form to the style of poem that John Agard has selected. So it might be you could talk about the poet's choice of form to describe or talk about their subject matter. AO3, this is the understanding between the text and the context, and it does link, as I've said to you before, to the writers. So what are the writers' big ideas? What are the writers trying to say? Now you could, certainly in the case of our romantic poets, where it's a little bit easier to sort of talk about the context, what are the poets writing about? How are they wanting the world to change? How do they want the reader to react and respond to the text that they've written as well? You could also sort of talk about the relevance of the poem to today. So for example, in the poem London, that poem I think is still relevant to today's society. If you think about the way that poverty is a really maintains a really important feature of the political landscape. So talking about context is a really important part, and you need to have addressed all three of those assessment objectives in order to achieve those top marks. Now, a lot of you have asked in the past what an essay structure should look like, and to be honest with you, for those high marks, there is not a kind of hard and fast rule that you have to apply. There are advantages and disadvantages to all of them. My advice to you would be to disregard structure 1, where basically you deal with the themes, narration, language, form, and structure in text A. Then you make some kind of comparative comment that links text A and text B, and then you do exactly the same for your second poem. You could do that one, and it might help you kind of focus on one poem at a time. It will, I think, though, mean that you don't always achieve those comparative marks within your response. Structure 2, on the other hand, is possibly a better one because it enables you to deal with the same kind of focus at the same time. So if you look at structure 2, you might deal with the themes found in poem A, and then deal with the themes found in poem B, the language found in poem A, the language found in poem B. And if you like, each one of these sort of points here is an individual paragraph. So in a sense, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different paragraphs that you could talk about and use in your writing. You could do that. The advantage with that is you're dealing with the same theme at the time, or the same language sort of features at the time. And it's a fairly sort of sensible structure to your writing. My advice, though, would be to do it, and it's slightly different to structure A, is you integrate your themes, and you don't differentiate between text A and text B necessarily, but you integrate, and you sort of say in poem A, this is what we see, whereas in poem B, this is what we see. And in this case, the writer is trying to achieve whatever type of effect. So my advice to you would be to think about how you're going to organise your comparative writing structure, and consider either structure 2 or structure 3 within your writing. And what I would encourage you to do is speak with your teacher about the sort of different sort of structures that you could include, and they might be able to give you some examples of what that might look like. I'm not going to talk about it too much in this response because I wanted to give you other bits and pieces to go away with, but that's certainly something that would be useful for you to go away and have a conversation with your teacher. Now, a possible question for the exam. The thread, if you like, the bits that won't change will be compare the ways poets present ideas about, and then the bits in bold are the ones which are likely to change. So the example, the one I'm going to talk to you guys about today, is the power of humans. And in your exam, they will give you a poem, so they are going to tell you which poem that you are going to write about, and you will choose another poem here. Now, for example, if I was thinking about the power of humans, well, there's lots of these ones. You could talk about, say, Ozymandias would be one. London, as we're going to talk about today. The power or lack of power in the prelude. The power of the Duke in My Last Duchess. The power or the lack of power of humans in Exposure. The power of the family, if you like, in Kamikaze. So those sorts of things might be relevant for you to talk about. And notice that I mentioned the lack of power as much as the power in itself, because that might be something you might want to consider. So for example, in Exposure, Wilfred Owen demonstrates that there is a lack of power that he has against nature. So that might be something, and a nice point of comparison to think about. So for example, in Checking Out My History and Exposure, both poems deal with the lack of power that the speakers experience within their lives. So that might be something you could think about. Another question might be the power of identity. You might have the power of culture, the power of memory, the power of history, or it could be anything relevant linked to those poems. So think about the themes you found within the poem and have a think about which ones you think are going to be the most suitable. My advice for you in the exam is not to go in with a strict rule about the poems you are going to compare, because it's really thinking about the question. What is the question asking you, and what is the most suitable poem that is a comparative point? Inevitably, there are going to be some poems that you know better than others, and that's natural. And there might be some poems that you feel more confident speaking about. But avoid going into the exam with a very specific idea of what you're going to do, because it might be the question is going to direct you towards certain poems. For example, it might be the power of nature, in which case I wouldn't talk about, say, My Last Duchess, even though there is a lack of nature. It might ask you about, for example, in the power of culture. You might talk about how there is a lack of culture described in any of these poems. Not really a relevant thing to think about. So you've got to think and apply the question appropriately for you in the exam. Now, the two poems that I'm going to focus on in today's video are Checking Out My History and London. I'm not going to talk or read these poems to you, and it might be a useful opportunity now for you to pause this video and have a read of both of these poems, so that you've got a fairly good idea of what you're going to be talking about and writing about. One thing that I would recommend definitely with Checking Out My History, and you may have already seen this in your lessons, is the John Agard video where he delivers and performs this poem. And that's something that I was mentioning earlier about the form of this poem. This is a performance poem. The form of it is performance. And I think specifically, if you look at kind of the moments in the text where he talks about old King Cole was a merry old soul, there is a very tuneful, very melodic use of the way that language is used here, which contrasts with other moments of the poem which are more aggressive, dem and tell. So those sorts of things would be useful for you to think about within this poem as well. So think about kind of what he says, how he delivers it, what's the pace of the poem, because who better to talk about the writer's methods and ideas than the writer themselves. Now clearly we don't have William Blight to talk about the poem of London, but what you certainly should be able to read this and hopefully have a good idea about it. But just like what we talked about with John Agard and Checking Out My History in terms of the melody within it, apply the same to London. What kind of tone, what kind of tune, if this poem was going to be sung, for example, what kind of tone of voice might we have when we read this poem? So it might be useful, pause the video, just familiarise yourself with the two poems that we're going to talk about today, and then you're very welcome to press play and continue watching it. Now, you've probably heard in your lessons reference to the big ideas, and in many ways this is what the first AO1 objective is asking you to talk about. It's that informed response. It might help you to think about what on earth is this poem about, and you could form this could form part of your essay structure. It might be your first paragraph is about, say in this case, the injustice of power distribution. Your second paragraph might be the marginalized, and your third paragraph might be the neglectful impact of the establishment. It doesn't have to be these three things, but I would say each one of these three big ideas kind of link to all of the poem. It's not just one specific moment, it's links to the whole of the poem, the whole ideas, if you like, the big idea of the poem. In other words, what the poets were writing about. The reason why I've chosen these three is because I think that actually in both poems the writer has very similar ideas. The difference is the way they present those ideas, and it's those differences that are going to form part of my essay response. Now, you might have different ideas, or you might want to phrase these in different ways, and that's fine. And in fact, I'd encourage that, because that enables you to get to that personalised, informed response too. But have a think about what big ideas you found within these poems and how those poets present them differently. Now, generally speaking, I'd say that in both poems there is a criticism of authority. We've got a theme of censorship. The writer uses the senses to present their point. We've got a use of repetition, and I've put a star there because repetition is part of a structural technique, and I've put that as a difference too. But both poems use the language device of repetition, and they both use sounds. They both use, and very specific about the use of sound within their poem, and that's definitely to think about. For example, think about highlighting the first letter of each word in a particular line of poetry. That might give you a certain tone that's been created, like D or T or F or S sounds. What sorts of things do they conjure up in your head? Differences? Well, they're both written in a very different style. The form of the poem is very different. We'd say certainly from a structural point of view, London contains a very rigid structural techniques, the similar kind of syllable count, the rhyme scheme, the number of lines per stanza. Whereas in Checking Out My History, it's very free, it's very open, and it's almost like John Agard doesn't have to feel confined by the rules of poetry anymore, which is, I think, a link to the bigger ideas of the poem. Their context is very different. John Agard is talking about the Eurocentric approach of history and the way that's taught and the way that that's linked to identity, whereas William Blake is writing from a romantic poetry perspective. And so, but they both, again, if you think back to those big ideas, they both kind of link to this idea of the establishment and the criticism of it, but their context is very different. The other thing that I'd say, and this kind of again is a sort of structural point of view, is the solutions they have to their problems. If you look at the way that London ends, it almost ends in the worst possible way, that life as we know it is going to be destroyed. Whereas the ending of Checking Out My History is very different. It's very celebratory, and it's the speaker taking a lot of control over the way in which he is leading his life. Now, one thing that I would recommend that you think about, and you might need a second or two to get your head around this, within your writing, you don't necessarily have to look for all similarities and all differences. Students have asked me in the past, do I do a paragraph on how they're similar, and then a paragraph on how they're different, and then another paragraph on how they're similar? No, not really. What I would be doing, though, is if there is a similarity, I'd want to look for the differences within it. So, for example, the criticism of authority, they are similar in that they both criticize authority, but they are different in that the authority that they are criticizing are not the same people. Equally, there might be differences found within similarity. So, for example, the rhyme scheme in London is very rigid, and as opposed to the rhyme scheme in Checking Out My History. But the fact they both contain rhyme is a similarity found within a difference. So consider those sorts of things within your writing, and that might help you kind of explore different layers of analysis within your writing. So with that in mind, I've just got over the next couple of slides a few examples of quotations found within the poem that I think you would be able to talk about, and some of them I've already sort of made reference to within the earlier sections of this video. But if you think about the way that Checking Out My History starts, dem tell me, what dem want to tell me. We've got a very sort of vague expression of who dem is, but notice it's been repeated 3 times. So there's a clear instruction to the reader to be told of dem is somebody who we don't like. If you think about this unnamed person, it leads up to interpretation for us as the reader. It could be, and is certainly the establishment. That's quite a general point to make, though. It could be those in government, those in education, teachers perhaps, the media. But I think John Agard makes it very, very vague to a certain extent in terms of who it is. It's down to the reader to talk about or to think about. Notice the word use, dem and tell, as I mentioned earlier about the way that sound is used. Lots of D and T sounds here, dem tell me. So it's a fairly aggressive opening to it. Certainly something you could talk about in this first part of the poem is the fact that the reader is being written in a fairly phonetic, in a dialect kind of way. It's essentially forcing the reader to be able to adopt the speech pattern that John Agard wants us to adopt. And I think that is something that you could talk about in terms of the big ideas of this poem, that actually the power of speech, the power of identity, are people who don't come from England or Europe being forced to speak in a particular way. You could then compare that to the use of repetition in London. Now, this doesn't come from the opening part of this poem, so in John Agard's it's the first impression, whereas this second bit comes from, in London, sorry, comes from a little bit later. But again, we've got that repetition of every. Blake is trying to make sure that we are aware that this affects everybody in society. So there's in both poems we have this repetition that's been used, but they've been used in different ways. And notice we've been told that there's every cry and every man and every infant. Now, I would say it'd be easy to suggest that Blake is is disregarding women here, and I don't personally think he is. I think he's using this idea of man as in mankind. Everybody in society is being affected, both young and old, in every voice that we've got. So we've been told that everywhere we look, that the injustice of power is affecting the people cruelly, perhaps. Going back to John Agard, though, the way that we end this poem is a very celebratory way. But now, there's a Volta that's kicking in there, that he is carving out me identity. He is taking control and making permanent changes within the society that he's living in. You think about this carving, I always think about like the way you might carve a piece of wood, that you create something that actually he's not relying upon those in power to tell him about his own identity. He is taking responsibility for himself, maybe because those in power, having listened to his messages, don't want to change or don't want to respond to his ideas. But in either case, we end the poem in a very different way to the way we started. Unlike in London, though, things get progressively worse, and we have at the ending of this poem the expression, it blasts the newborn infant's tear. So first we have a repetition of infant from the early part of the poem, but the expression of it blasting, this curse that has been blasting our new infant's tear. We certainly do not get an impression of celebration here. In fact, it's the worst it possibly can, and this infection, this plague, is now getting worse. It used to be marks on people's faces earlier in the poem, and now it's a plague that's infecting the newborn infant's tear. So actually, what I think Blake is suggesting here is that society is going to get worse and worse and worse. Arguably the most famous line from this poem, one of the most famous lines from any poem, I think, is the mind-forged manacles. I've missed my inverted comma there. And so you could talk about the injustice of power, that not only a voice is being affected, it's the mind that's being affected as well. And I think that kind of links also to checking out my history as well, that the use of the mind, your thoughts, your ideas affect you, and that they are being manacled, this metallic cuffs that are placed upon people's brains, that they're not able to think for themselves and they're not able to look after themselves at all. Another way that you could think about this poem is the blight of the marginalized, those people who are pushed to the edges of society. Now, just like I said before, with checking out my history, he does talk about how in our society we're not being told about these sorts of people. We're not told about the Caribs and the Arawaks. I know every single class I've ever spoken to, they have no idea about who these people are. I'll be honest, I didn't really until I read this poem. And again, equally, people are beginning to get a better idea of who Toussaint is. Mary Seacole is a relatively famous figure within British society, but only in certain parts of society. But either way, what he's showing us is that certainly in the case of the first two people I've mentioned here, so Mary Seacole and Toussaint, these are slaves. And certainly Toussaint is a slave with vision. He's able to see. He's able to go beyond his own position and place and make a change. A bit like perhaps how John Agard feels at the end of the poem with him carving out his history. Mary Seacole, just like Florence Nightingale, wanted to go and treat people during the Crimean War, but she went even when the British said no. So she is somebody who's been pushed to the side of society. She wants to volunteer and help Britain in that case, in terms of help their soldiers, but she went even though she was told no. So again, if you think about what I said before about the use of celebration, the carving out my history, both Toussaint and Mary Seacole carved out their history, carved out their passage and right through the world. We do have, unfortunately, though, the reference to the Caribs and Arawaks, and I say unfortunately because we're not told in our history lessons who they are. They had a culture that has very much been marginalized by particularly in America, those people who took over America with Christopher Columbus. But they have a culture all of their own that is not mentioned about at all. And his question is, what happened to them? He's actually asking us, although there isn't a question mark here, what's happened to them? What's caused the way they're feeling and what's their history. Now, linking to London, then will apply to the marginalised. We've got the hapless soldier's sigh. Even our soldiers, whose job it is to protect us, to look after us, to go into places and do the things that we need them to do in order to maintain our life, they're sighing. You know, maybe they're sighing because they are feeling helpless. Maybe they're sighing because they are themselves being pushed and neglected by the government as well. Finally, one of our last moments of the poem is and I mentioned a little bit of this earlier, is the youthful harlot's curse. So this harlot, this is about young prostitution that's taking place in the streets of London and elsewhere, I'm certain, as well. Now, you might argue that this curse that is being inflicted on them is they are cursing society. I think it's more the other way around, that actually society is cursing them. They're forcing them into the midnight streets. You think about the connotations we might have with midnight being evil and dark, and it's this curse of the sexually transmitted diseases, or perhaps the life that they are being forced into, that is making them feel the way that they do. So once again, we have in both poems the references to those who've been marginalised, but their treatment of them are very different. Finally, the neglectful impact of the establishment. We have again this idea of aggressive issues that have been taking place, and I think in this case for me, London and checking out my history have got a similarity. We have this bandaged up my eye, blind me to my own identity. Notice that plosive sound of the B. This idea that identity and what you can see in society are interlinked, they're connected, just like the marks that are placed upon people. So you've got marks of weakness, marks of woe. So you can physically see, or in checking out my history's case, not see your society and your culture being represented and shown. If we look at checking out my history, we are told of, if you think about our lessons, when I ask my classes, do you know about the dish who ran away with the spoon? A good number of them know what that is. They know the nursery rhyme. We're told about Dick Whittington, we're told about Robin Hood, we're told about Old King Cole. We're told about all of these features are part of British life, but we're not told about arguably people who have real people who've had a significant impact on history. So you might say that actually it's not that the neglect of the establishment doesn't come from the fact they're not being taught. People are being taught and we are being educated, but maybe we're not being taught about the things we should be being taught about, and that's where the neglect comes from. In London, though, the neglect possibly comes from the fact that everything is controlled. So actually, it's not that the government are not doing anything. It's the fact that maybe they're doing too much, and this chartering, they're taking out too much control over not only the cities that are being created, represented by the word street, but also the lifeblood that runs through London, the River Thames. So you could talk about how the neglect and the impact that they're having on society affects every part of it, and that ultimately then leads to blood running down the palace walls. And I noticed that it's not, for me, I read that as outside the palace walls. So you have the palace of the establishment being protected, and they're quite happy for the blood to be on what they can't see, because they're protected within their their environment. So they're not necessarily getting their hands dirty and thinking about it. But it's this quite sort of bloody gothic kind of image that's being described midway through London. So, just to go back to some of the things I mentioned before, this criticism of authority. I didn't really talk about too much of censorship, but that kind of links to the Mind-Forged Manacles that we've got. So those are some of the similarities that I hope I've spoken about during this video. Inevitably, there's only so much that I could talk about in a short video like this, and I could speak for hours and hours more about how these poems are written. But I hope that this video has given you some ideas of the things you could think about. Just to finish, and it would be worthwhile either taking a screenshot or just pausing this video and making a note of some of these phrases. Here's something that you might have seen in our lessons already about how you might go about writing these poems, or certainly if you think about this box here, how you might compare poems. So you might think about those if you need some help with your sentence starters. I hope this video was helpful to you, everybody. Thank you for watching it to the end. And if you have any suggestions about other videos that you'd like your English department to put together for you, then I'm more than happy to get that up and running for you. All right, best of luck for your exams, and we'll be there every step of the way for you. Bye bye.